Jim Steele's our next speaker. He has a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Master's as well. Taught at the San Francisco State University and the Sierra Nevada Field Campus, courses on ornithology and botany. He was also a principal investigator for the Neotropical Migratory Bird Monitoring at the Tahoe National Forest Project. He's going to be talking about Arctic amplification and polar bear fantasies, I guess, are missed.
Coral acidification also.
And coral acidification. Welcome to the stage, Jim Steele.
I'm going to be the first to go over, and I'm going to claim Joe's and Sam's time that they gave up. Thank you. To start off with Arctic amplification, we've all seen graphs like this, and it simply refers to in the Arctic temperatures are rising 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And the narrative to make this part of the climate crisis is that it starts off with CO2 melting the ice. Increased CO2, more ice melts, but then it has feedback. So you have less ice, you lose albedo, so solar heating can happen, or you release more water vapor like Joe was talking about, and you can have warming from that. What I want to convince you of is what am I pressing to, that it's not CO2, but the main driver of why ice is melting in the Arctic is because you have this warm Atlantic water increasingly come into the Arctic. And it's how that warm water gets raised to the surface that's melting the ice. So the first hint that it's not CO2, if we look at the maximum extent of Arctic sea ice, and that happens in the end of March. And just recently, people said, oh, March in 2025 and 2026 they were the same, and it was the lowest extent on record. And how scary is that? So we see in the internet, oh, here's this scary thing. Well, if I put in the Arctic Circle, you see that most of the Arctic all reached their maximum sea ice. There was only one place around the Nordic seas and the Barents Sea where ice is being lost. And the yellow line is the average extent between 1980 and 2010, and the blue in between is how much is melted. It looks pretty insignificant, but it's scary to some people. Well, you can know that CO2 is not particular about where it's going to put its heat, so it's pretty foolish to say that CO2 is melting ice here, but it's not melting the ice next door to it. So there's got to be another dynamic. And so if we look at what's happening in the Arctic, we can see these warm currents are coming from the Atlantic, and there's sort of like 3 major pathways. It branches off, but one pathway is entering the Nordic seas. It curves to the west, and that warm water goes along the Greenland coast and helps melt some of the glaciers that are grounded below the surface. The main thing goes straight up into the Fram Strait, and then that enters warm water into the deeper basins in the center. And then there's a major turn to the east that goes into the Barents Sea. So why is the Barents Sea a big issue? There's been an increase in volume over decades of warm water going into the Barents. And the Barents is a fairly shallow sea with a very rough terrain for a seafloor. So as that water flows over, it's forced up over these hills and it reaches the surface. So it melts all the water all the ice around the Barents Sea. And you see it's the same place that everybody's worried about sea ice melting is where this warm water is going into the Barents Sea. Well, if you also look at the bathymetry of the whole Arctic, we'll see once that warm water leaves the Barents Sea, and it leaves most of the heat there, the Barents Sea is actually warming 7 times faster than the global average. But that less heated water still continues around the Eurasian coast. If you notice, the light blue is all how shallow the waters are. And those seas were left high and dry during the glacial maximum. 50% of all that seafloor is 50 meters or less. And why that's important is the mixing depth of the water there is about average 50 meters. So any warm water that goes up on these shallow coasts gets mixed up to the top and it helps melt it. But if it's not warm enough, it doesn't melt it like it's doing in the Barents Sea, but it's thinning and making it, thinning the ice and making it easier to melt in the summer. So if we look at a picture of the minimum that's happened, you see that the All along the coast is where you have the most sea ice melt. Where the ice is remaining is over the deeper oceans, because it's not that warm water is not so easily raised to the surface. And if we look at sort of a history, in 1886, the maximum sea level came down to the top of Norway, maybe down to Iceland. By 1966, we see that there were more intrusions of Atlantic waters. And they're seeing this has been happening since 1900 at least. And you see it's happening mostly in the pathway where the Fram Strait is. Not so much in the Barents Sea, but as the pressure systems shift, by 1995, it's represented by the red line. Into the Fram Strait, it's not as much melting, but it's now, everything's focused in the Barents Sea. So it's where this warm water is being distributed is one of the big issues. And if we go back to the history of this Nordic Sea, you'll see that there's been a steady decline that's happened since the end of the Little Ice Age. And between 1860 and 1900, 20% of the ice was already lost, way before CO2 could have had any kind of major impact. Now, the warm Atlantic water in the places that aren't shallow sits at a level between 100 or 200 meters at the top and 900 meters at the bottom. So how does that get up to the surface of the ice? I use a solar pond dynamic to illustrate how this works. Different universities have been studying solar ponds as a cheap way to heat a building or a greenhouse. And you dig a pond that's about 10 feet deep, and you stratify it into 3 layers. The upper surface zone gets heated by the sun, but it can convect the heat back up to the surface, and it ventilates by radiation or evaporative cooling. The storage zone at the bottom is saturated with salt. And that makes the water so dense that even if you heat it, it has no buoyancy to rise up above what's above it. So the water in that storage zone can reach 90 degrees Celsius. And they can use that heat to funnel it off to a building or whatever. And to keep that storage zone from being eroded by the upper layer where heat can be convected, the important thing is the insulation zone. Well, this is perfectly analogous to the way this warm Atlantic water is sitting in the Arctic. You have this Atlantic water coming in between 100 and 900 meters. And the reason it doesn't rise is because there's a halocline, which means that the salt density is intermediate between the top and the bottom, just like the insulation zone. As early as 1902, Nansen said this halocline is the reason Arctic sea ice can form. It prevents the warm water from melting the ice at the surface. Well, between 1950 and 1990, scientists studying the Arctic found no evidence of greenhouse warming despite rising CO2. But then after 1990, all these scientists started noticing that the halocline was being reduced or raised. And it was allowing that Atlantic water to reach the surface or get closer to the surface so it can exude more heat and melt the ice from below. Even in 2025, there was just a paper in Polyakov wrote, he said, the winter ventilation of the halocline in the Eastern Eurasian Basin has resulted in more than a 2-fold rate in sea ice loss caused by these ocean heat fluxes. And if they measure the watts per meter squared, you're getting 10, 20, or far more than that, depending on how close the Atlantic water gets to the surface, reaching the ice. Compared to, at most, during that same period, the CO2 couldn't add more than 2 watts per meter squared to the surface. So clearly the major dynamic, this melting the ice, is coming from below. And there's one paradox in that. If this warmth that's been trapped in the ocean, it sort of creates an energy imbalance. It doesn't allow the heat to go back to space. But now you're ventilating it, you're bringing an energy balance back. Willie knows about energy balances, but as it ventilates, it warms the air above. And a warmer air temperature then gets interpreted as part of the crisis. Look at how much the air is warming. But it's really, it's cooling the system, but warming the air temporarily. Something to think about. Between 2000 and 2022, the minimum ice has sort of stopped declining as rapidly as it had been. And part of that is the haloclines have been changing. So the red shows you regions where the sea ice has increased. And it correlates with a thickening of the halicline in that region. The dark blue shows where there's some of the ice is being lost, and that correlates with their halicline is declining. And there's another dynamic where how much thick multi-year ice gets transported out of the Arctic. And that's controlled by high pressure systems. There's two major natural oscillations that affect the flow of ice: Arctic oscillation and the Arctic dipole. And in this case, you get this high pressure system over Canada. Its clockwise winds force the ice one way. A low pressure system over Russia is counterclockwise where they align. They drive this thing called the transpolar drift. Depending on how strong the pressure systems are or where their location varies, you can drive a lot of ice out of the Arctic, or you can build ice in the Arctic. So that's another dynamic. If you sort of look here at the way the currents are moving in the Arctic, the Buford Gyre kind of traps ice. And you can see the transpolar current in this case is driving multi-year ice to converge up against the northern coast of Greenland or the islands. And that, when it converges, the ice kind of overlaps and thickens naturally. So these natural oscillations that we're seeing that are affecting the ice. I'll just skip through. Now, shrinking ice really doesn't pull on people's heartstrings as much. So you have to create something so people's emotions will overwhelm their critical thinking. And so you have polar bears are going extinct. And the narrative for that is bears hunt on the ice. That's a fact. And there's less ice right now. And that's a fact. But then they say, well, less hunting time on the ice means polar bears are threatened with starvation and extinction, especially if you believe CO2 is going to keep melting more ice. And then you get a picture like this from the National Geographic. You find the most sickly, ugly bear with a genetic club foot. And you say, the narrative you put on it, oh, this is climate change. And I've had guys with PhDs hold up a picture of this and say, this is climate change, you're full of it. It's amazing how its emotions overwhelm people. But I have friends that are naturalists or scientists that have done cruises in the Arctic, and they say, I find plenty of fat polar bears. It would be a lot easier to find one than to find that sickly bear. And if you look at the data, polar bear numbers have been increasing since they started regulating hunting. And it's gone from an estimate of 5,000 up to over 31,000. So none of this supports the idea of extinction, but there's other facts that show why it's such a fairy tale. Its access to ice is an irrelevant metric. The key metric is access to their main prey, the ringed seals. In the winter, all the rest of the marine mammals go except for the ringed seal stays there during the winter. And they need breathing holes to do this, but they like to stay in the water. They don't want to come out on the ice where they're easy pickings, and partly it's the temperature. The temperature over the Arctic is like minus 20 to minus 30 Celsius during the winter. The water is above freezing. And if you want to save energy, stay in the warm water. So they just poke their head up to a breathing hole for a few seconds and then go back in the water. So what they find is during the winter, the polar bears have access to ice between October and March, but their hunting success drops precipitously. And their weight reaches the lowest point in March because they can't catch these seals and they have nothing else to eat. The critical time for accessing their main prey starts when the seals have to give birth to their pups. The pups have to be above, sitting on the ice, and it takes them a month or two to gain enough blubber to insulate them so they can go into the water. So that makes them very accessible to the polar bears if they can find them. And after that, it continues that the seals have to come out on the ice until they'll do it from, say, May through the end of June to molt. And so they come out on the ice to sunbathe, which helps them molt their skin, so then they can do their next year's living. And that's when they're all accessible to the polar bears. So the critical time for polar bears is from March through the beginning of July. The rest of the time, they just don't have any access to the seals. So it's really not how much ice is important, but it's about this access. And they also don't tell you the minimum benefits of minimum ice. For the seals to make their breathing holes, they bust their head through the top of it, and then they gnaw and claw to keep it open. They need new thin ice to do that. And so when you have this melting ice, you can make more breathing holes. And when you have more reduced sea ice, you have more photosynthesis. So the satellite study shows chlorophyll is increased. Primary productivity between 1998 and 2018 increased by 57%. So an elementary school kid, as opposed to a PhD expert, they know the basics. So if you can have more photosynthesis, more algae, you support more zooplankton or krill or shrimp, which feeds more fish, which feeds more seals, which makes more happy, fat polar bears. And which is a completely different story than what the experts on extinction are saying, which reminds me of the Feynman quote that don't judge someone, don't confuse education with intelligence, because you can get a PhD and still be an idiot. Now I'm going to run out of a little time, so don't hurt me. The last thing I want to say is ocean acidification. Climate change is evil twin. And what you'll see on a NASA NOAA website is this: as CO2 goes in the water, it lowers pH, and it's causing shells to dissolve. So more CO2 means it's harder to manage your cells. This study, they show, they use dead shells. And what's wrong with that is all the mollusks, clams, mussels, snails, they have a protective coating, an organic coating called the periostracum. That's allowed them to live in pH 6 waters. It prevents corrosive waters from reaching the shell. And so if there's no effect from a drop in pH in the ocean because of that protection. You have the same issue for coral reefs. The coral polyps in the tissue that connects them, called the coenosarc, they protect the reef. They prevent an organic layer that prevents corrosive waters from reaching the calcium carbonate reef. Now, shells in the reefs are made of calcium carbonate. You need a calcium ion and a carbonate ion to come together. And so if you have less carbonate ions, you would say that could minimize the ability to make a reef or to make a shell. And it's true that if you add more CO2 to the water, it interacts with the water and forms bicarbonate ions and carbonate ions. And if you can see, the green curve shows that as pH drops, carbon ions disappear. Well, and you can probably read 1,000 different peer-reviewed papers that will say the same story, that ocean acidification makes it harder to make a shell or a reef because you're losing carbonate ions in the ocean. The fact is that not a single calcifying organism imports carbonate ions. Carbonate ions are charged, so you can't pass through a cell membrane unless you have a transport molecule. They've looked as hard as they can. Not a single person has found a transport molecule for carbonate ions. What they find is lots of transport molecules for bicarbonate. And bicarbonate is bountiful. You can see just between pH 9 and 6, 90% of the water is made out of bicarbonate. So there's no threat there. The carbonate ion is irrelevant again. So just to give a quick look at this, if you want to make a calcium carbonate shell, you import calcium. Because it's charged positive 2, you have to get rid of two hydrogen protons to keep the electrical neutrality. That brings the calcium in. To bring a carbonate ion in, you first bring in a bicarbonate ion, because there's lots of transport molecules for that. CO2 is neutral, so it can go in. But because you're getting rid of the hydrogen ions, you're pumping those hydrogen ions out of where you're calcifying, it causes the carbonate ions to be formed from CO2 and bicarbonate. So the carbonate ions are all made internally. And so they can grow the reefs internally. And just one last point on what makes corals so adaptable. They have a symbiotic relationship with algae. The algae they need CO2 for photosynthesis. Bicarbonate ions, carbonate ions, they can't use it all. So in that case, the same coral that's pumping hydrogen ions out starts pumping the hydrogen ions in to the area where they're photosynthesizing, and they pump in bicarbonate ions. That extra hydrogen ion causes the bicarbonate to change to CO2, and now you get more photosynthesis. So the coral, they love that we're having more CO2. And I went 2 minutes over my time. All right, okay, good. So shell making and reef making has nothing to do with the CO2 into the water.